The sun hung low over Atlanta, casting long shadows across the streets. Special Agent Maya Reed, a woman of quiet confidence and unyielding dedication, guided her car through the late afternoon traffic. She had just wrapped up a grueling investigation, a months-long pursuit of a drug cartel that had taken her across state lines and through countless sleepless nights. There was a certain satisfaction in knowing she was close to cracking the case, even if the weight of it pressed heavy on her shoulders. Maya's hands rested lightly on the steering wheel, her dark skin glinting faintly in the light filtering through the windshield. She had learned early in life to carry herself with poise, no matter the situation. In her career as an FBI agent, and in her life as a black woman in America, composure was a shield, one she had wielded against countless subtle dismissals, assumptions, and outright challenges. The city bustled around her, alive with the sounds of car horns, distant laughter, and the murmur of 1,000 lives unfolding simultaneously. It was a scene she loved, Atlanta in its messy, chaotic rhythm, a patchwork of stories that somehow all fit together. Her mind, however, was elsewhere. The case details swirled in her thoughts, connecting dots that had yet to reveal their full picture. It was almost a relief when the flashing blue lights appeared in her rearview mirror, cutting through the haze of her concentration. For a moment, she felt disoriented. She checked her speedometer. She wasn't speeding. Her turn signal had been used. Her lane changes smooth. Still, she signaled and pulled over. The procedural routine as automatic as her heartbeat. A police cruiser eased to a stop behind her, and she adjusted her rearview mirror to watch the officer step out. He was tall, his face sharp and unreadable beneath his cap. Officer Nathan Collins. She caught the name on the badge as he approached her window, his hand resting lightly on the holster of his gun. She rolled down her window and offered a polite, measured smile. "Good afternoon, officer. Is there a problem?" Collins didn't return the greeting. His voice was curt, his tone laced with an edge she couldn't quite place. "License and registration." Maya tilted her head slightly, a reflexive gesture of curiosity. She reached for her FBI badge, flipping it open and holding it out for him to see. "I'm Special Agent Maya Reed, with the Bureau. I'm on duty." Collins glanced at the badge, his eyes narrowing in what seemed less like scrutiny and more like dismissal. "I said license and registration," he repeated, his tone sharper now. A small knot formed in Maya's stomach, though her face betrayed nothing. She had met officers like him before, the kind who wore their authority not as a responsibility, but as a weapon. She had hoped those encounters were behind her, relics of a time before she wore the badge of federal authority. "Officer," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm a federal agent. I'm not required to provide that unless I'm under suspicion of a crime. Is there a reason you've pulled me over?" Collins leaned closer, his face inches from hers. "Step out of the vehicle." The words hung in the air, heavy and deliberate. A sense of unease began to seep into her resolve, but she remained still, her hands visible on the steering wheel. "Excuse me? You heard me," he said, his voice louder now, a tone designed to assert dominance. "Step out of the vehicle." Maya hesitated for a fraction of a second, weighing her options. She had spent her career enforcing the law, and in that moment, she knew better than most that the law wasn't always applied evenly. She reached for the door handle and opened it slowly, stepping out into the late afternoon light. The street around them was quiet, though she noticed a few people lingering at a distance, their eyes flicking toward the unfolding scene with a mixture of curiosity and wariness. Collins moved toward her, his hand still hovering near his holster. "Turn around," he ordered. Her heart skipped a beat. "I'd like to know what I'm being accused of," she said, keeping her voice steady, though it was clear the situation was veering into dangerous territory. "You're resisting an officer's instructions," he snapped. "Turn around, or I'll do it for you." Maya swallowed the anger rising in her chest. This wasn't new. Not the tension, not the dismissal, not the weight of her identity being reduced to something that could be so easily overlooked. But this time, it felt heavier. She turned around, raising her hand slightly as Collins grabbed her arm and twisted it behind her back. The cold metal of the handcuffs bit into her skin, and she could feel the stares of the onlookers burning into her back. This is a mistake, she said quietly, her voice laced with both frustration and dignity. You're making a mistake. Collins leaned in close as he tightened the cuffs. You think that badge makes you untouchable? He whispered, his tone dripping with disdain. Maya closed her eyes for a moment, forcing herself to breathe. She wasn't untouchable. She never had been. This was the reality. She lived in a world where the badge on her hip didn't erase the color of her skin, where her authority could be so easily disregarded by someone unwilling to see it. As Collins led her toward the police car, she straightened her back, forcing herself to walk tall. Whatever this was, it wasn't the end. It couldn't be. The fight for justice wasn't just in the cases she worked, it was in moments like this. In the quiet resistance of standing firm against what was wrong. She had been through worse. She would get through this, too. The precinct was quieter than Maya Reed had expected. It wasn't the bustling hub of law enforcement she knew from her own field office phones ringing, voices raised in urgency, the sharp scent of coffee brewing in the background. No, this station felt different. It was older, smaller, tucked away in the outskirts of the city. The faint hum of fluorescent lights buzzed overhead as Officer Collins led her down the narrow hallway. Her wrists bound in cold, unforgiving steel. She kept her posture straight, her expression calm, though her mind was anything but. Maya had spent years perfecting the art of composure, knowing that in her line of work and in her life it was often the difference between survival and defeat. The holding cell was at the far end of the corridor, a small, dimly lit space with bars that cast long, faint shadows across the floor. Collins unlocked the door and gestured for her to step inside. Enjoy your stay, Agent Reed, he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. He slammed the door shut before she could respond, the metallic clang reverberating in the silence. Maya stood still for a moment, taking in her surroundings. The cell was bare, save for a small bench bolted to the wall and a toilet in the corner. It smelled faintly of mildew, a scent that clung to the damp air like an unwelcome guest. She sat on the bench, her hands resting on her knees, and let her eyes adjust to the dim light. This wasn't her first time in a holding cell, but it was the first time she had been on this side of the bars. The silence was broken by the sound of footsteps approaching. A young officer appeared at the door, his face pale and nervous. His name badge read Hayes. He held a clipboard in one hand and a set of keys in the other, though his grip on both seemed unsteady. Agent Reed, he began, his voice cautious, almost apologetic. I need to process you for holding. Maya studied him, her sharp gaze catching the flicker of unease in his eyes. He looked like someone caught between two conflicting impulses, like a man standing on the edge of a decision that might cost him more than he was ready to pay. You already know who I am, she said evenly. I don't belong here, Officer Hayes, and deep down, you know that too. Hayes hesitated, his pen hovering above the clipboard. His eyes darted toward the hallway, as if expecting Collins to appear at any moment. I don't make the rules, he muttered, his voice barely audible. No, Maya replied, her tone calm but firm. But you do choose whether to follow orders that you know are wrong. For a moment, the only sound was the faint buzz of the lights overhead. Hayes shifted on his feet, his discomfort clear. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but the sound of heavy boots in the hallway cut him off. Collins entered the room, his presence as commanding as it was oppressive. He looked at Hayes, then at Maya, his lips curling into a smirk. What's taking so long? He demanded, his tone sharp. Hayes straightened, his shoulders tensing under the weight of Collins' gaze. Just finishing up, sir, he stammered, quickly jotting something down on the clipboard. Collins snorted. Get it done. We don't have all day. His eyes flicked to Maya, and she met his gaze with quiet defiance. If he was looking for fear, he wouldn't find it here. As Collins turned and walked away, Hayes let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. He glanced at Maya again, his expression conflicted. I'm sorry, he said quietly, almost too softly for her to hear. Sorry doesn't fix this, Maya replied, her voice steady. But it's not too late to do the right thing. Hayes looked down, his grip tightening on the clipboard. He didn't respond. Instead, he left the room, the door clicking shut behind him. Maya leaned back against the wall, her thoughts racing. She had faced hostility before, dismissive stares, condescending remarks, assumptions that chipped away at the authority she had earned. But this felt different. This wasn't just bias. This was an abuse of power. Naked and unrestrained. The hours passed slowly, marked only by the faint hum of activity elsewhere in the precinct. Maya kept her mind focused, replaying the events of the day, searching for the thread she could pull to unravel whatever game Collins was playing. At some point, she heard footsteps again. This time, they were quieter, hesitant. The door creaked open, and Hayes stepped inside. He looked around nervously before speaking. "Agent Reed," he said, his voice low. "I think you're right. This isn't how it's supposed to go." Maya met his gaze, her own expression unreadable. "Then do something about it," she said simply. Hayes swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing in his throat. "Collins, he's not like the other officers," he admitted, his words tumbling out in a rush. "He's got connections, power. Nobody challenges him because they know what happens if they do." "And you?" Maya asked, her tone gentle but probing. "Are you going to stand by and let him get away with this?" Hayes hesitated, his eyes flicking to the door once more. "I don't know," he admitted, "but I can't keep pretending this is normal." It wasn't much, but it was a crack in the wall of silence that surrounded men like Collins. Maya leaned forward, her voice soft but resolute. "The system only works if people like you are willing to speak up. If you let fear silence you, then men like him win." Hayes didn't respond. Instead, he turned and left the room, his shoulders slumping as he disappeared into the hallway. Maya exhaled slowly, her breath steadying her resolve. She didn't know if Hayes would act, but she did know one thing: Collins had made a mistake, and she wasn't going to let him walk away from it unscathed. She wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for something bigger. Something that had always been worth the cost. The silence of the precinct after dark was unsettling. The hum of the fluorescent lights seemed louder. The emptiness of the narrow corridors more pronounced. Special Agent Maya Reed sat on the cold bench in her cell, her thoughts sharp and focused. The hours had stretched long, and with each passing moment, she felt the weight of the situation pressing harder against her. Somewhere down the hall, Officer Nathan Collins moved with the confidence of a man who believed he was untouchable. His authority, bolstered by years of unchecked power, lingered like a shadow over the station. Maya knew his type well: men who saw rules as tools to wield against others, but never themselves. She was thinking of how to dismantle that kind of power when the faint creak of the cell doors startled her. It wasn't the heavy, deliberate movement she'd grown used to from Collins. This was lighter, more cautious. Officer Chris Hayes stepped inside, his face pale and drawn. He looked over his shoulder before speaking, his voice barely above a whisper. "Agent Reed," he said, his words quick and nervous. "We don't have much time." Maya didn't move immediately. She studied him, her sharp gaze searching his expression for sincerity. Hayes was young, too young, perhaps, to fully understand the weight of the choices before him. But there was something in his eyes, a mixture of fear and determination, that told her he was trying to do what was right, even if he didn't know how. "What do you mean?" she asked, her voice calm and even, as if they were discussing nothing more than the weather. Hayes fidgeted with the keys in his hand. "Collins, he's planning something. I don't know what exactly, but it's not good. He's angry, angrier than I've ever seen him. If you stay here, I'm afraid." His voice trailed off, but the implication was clear. Maya leaned forward, her hands resting lightly on her knees. "Why are you telling me this now, Officer Hayes? You had hours to step in. What's changed?" Hayes hesitated, his fingers tightening around the keys. "I've seen enough to know he's crossed the line. And if I don't do something, I'm no better than him." He glanced at the door again, the tension in his shoulders betraying his fear. "Please, I can't stand by anymore." Maya nodded slowly, weighing his words. She didn't fully trust him. Trust wasn't something she gave freely, but she understood the courage it took for him to come this far. "All right," she said quietly. "What's the plan?" Hayes unlocked the cell door, the metallic click echoing in the stillness. "We'll go out the back. There's an exit near the archives." It's not monitored, and Collins won't think to look there right away. Maya stood, her movements deliberate and steady. She followed Hayes into the hallway, her senses on high alert. The station felt different now, every shadow and sound carrying a sense of foreboding. As they moved through the corridors, Hayes whispered, "Collins has been untouchable for years. He's got people on his side, officers who'll cover for him no matter what. But he's not invincible. If you can get out of here, maybe you can prove that." Maya's expression didn't change, but she filed away the information. Collins wasn't just a man abusing his power, he was the product of a system that enabled and protected him. Taking him down wouldn't be as simple as exposing his actions. It would require dismantling the structure that allowed him to thrive. They reached the back exit without incident, but the weight of their situation pressed heavily on both of them. Hayes fumbled with the lock, his hands shaking. "Almost there," he muttered. Maya glanced over her shoulder, her instincts telling her they were running out of time. "Stay calm," she said, her voice steady. "We'll get through this." The door finally opened, and the cool night air rushed in, sharp and bracing. Hayes motioned for her to follow, and together they slipped out into the alley behind the station. The city loomed in the distance, its lights flickering faintly against the dark sky. Hayes turned to her, his expression filled with urgency. "I'll take you to my car. We need to move fast. Collins will realize you're gone soon." Maya nodded, but her mind was already racing ahead. This wasn't just an escape, it was the beginning of a larger fight. Collins wouldn't stop at finding her. He would do everything in his power to silence her, to protect himself and the fragile facade he had built. As they reached the car, Hayes hesitated. "I'm putting everything on the line for this," he said, his voice quiet. "If Collins finds out I helped you." Maya met his gaze, her expression unflinching. "Then we make sure he doesn't get the chance," she said. "This isn't just about me. It's about everyone he's hurt. Everyone he's stepped on to hold onto his power. You've taken the first step, Officer Hayes. Now it's time to see it through." Hayes nodded, his resolve hardening. He opened the car door for her, and as they drove into the night, the city fading behind them, Maya felt a quiet determination settle over her. This wasn't just about escaping Collins. It was about confronting the unspoken truths that allowed men like him to exist. The road ahead would be long and uncertain, but Maya knew one thing with absolute clarity: this fight was far from over. The road stretched out into the night, dark and quiet, flanked by endless shadows of trees. The headlights of Officer Hayes' car cut through the stillness, illuminating the narrow, uneven path ahead. Special Agent Maya Reed sat in the passenger seat, her posture calm, though her mind worked with the precision of a finely tuned machine. Hayes gripped the steering wheel tightly, his knuckles white against the dashboard's faint glow. The silence between them was heavy, filled with the unspoken tension of shared fear. Outside, the world seemed to hold its breath. Maya glanced out the window, watching the trees blur into indistinct shapes. "He won't stop," she said, her voice steady but low. "You know that." Hayes nodded, his eyes fixed on the road. "I know. Collins doesn't let things go. He's not the type." Maya tilted her head slightly, observing the young officer. His fear was palpable, but so was his determination. She had seen it before: the struggle of someone trying to reconcile their place within a system they were beginning to understand was flawed. "He's not just coming after me," she said quietly. "You've made yourself a target now too." Hayes exhaled sharply, his grip tightening. "I couldn't stand by anymore. I've watched him get away with too much. I thought if I just kept my head down, it wouldn't touch me. But it doesn't work like that. Does it?" "No," Maya replied simply. "It doesn't." The car jolted slightly as Hayes turned onto a narrower path, the gravel crunching beneath the tires. They were heading deeper into the outskirts, away from the city lights and into the cover of the woods. The isolation offered a strange sense of safety, though Maya knew it was temporary at best. "Do you think you can stop him?" Hayes asked after a moment, his voice hesitant. "A man like Collins? He's got connections, allies, people who'll cover for him." Maya turned her gaze to him, her expression measured. "Nobody is untouchable, Officer Hayes. Not even him. But it takes more than one person to bring someone like him down." Hayes nodded slowly, as if her words carried a weight he was only beginning to understand. The forest loomed around them now, its dense canopy blocking out what little moonlight there was. Hayes slowed the car, pulling into a clearing where an old cabin stood, its weathered exterior blending into the shadows. This place hasn't been used in years, Hayes said, cutting the engine. We'll be safe here for a little while. Maya stepped out of the car, her boots crunching against the gravel. The air was crisp and cool, carrying the faint scent of damp earth and pine. She scanned the surroundings, her instincts on high alert. The cabin was small, its wooden frame sagging slightly, but it was sturdy enough. Inside, the space was sparse, a single room with a rickety table and 2 chairs. A small fireplace, and a cot pushed against one wall. Dust clung to every surface, and the faint smell of mildew lingered in the air. Maya moved through the room silently, taking stock of their surroundings. It's not much, Hayes said from the doorway, but it'll do for now. Maya nodded, her attention focused on the window. The trees outside formed a dense wall of shadows, their branches twisting like skeletal hands against the faint light of the stars. She turned back to Hayes. He'll figure out we've gone into the woods eventually. We need to be ready when he does. Hayes sat heavily on one of the chairs, his shoulders slumping. I don't get it, he said, his voice tinged with frustration. How does someone like Collins stay in power for so long? Everyone knows what he's like. They see it. Maya leaned against the wall, crossing her arms. Because it's easier to ignore something than to confront it. People convince themselves that it's not their problem, that someone else will step in. And in the meantime, men like Collins thrive. Hayes looked down at his hands, his fingers tracing the edge of the table. I should have done something sooner. You're doing something now, Maya said. That matters. The quiet settled between them again, though this time it felt less heavy, more reflective. Outside, the forest was alive with the faint sounds of crickets and the occasional rustle of leaves. It was a stark contrast to the tension simmering inside the cabin. As the night deepened, Maya kept her watch by the window, her mind sharp despite the exhaustion creeping into her body. She thought of all the moments that had led her here, the small slights, the quiet dismissals, the loud injustices that had marked her life. None of it was new. And yet, each time, it felt like a fresh wound. Behind her, Hayes shifted in his seat, his unease evident. Do you think people can change? He asked suddenly. Maya didn't look back, her gaze still fixed on the forest. People can change, but it's not easy. It takes work, and most people don't want to put in that work. Hayes was silent for a moment. Then he said, what about the system? Can that change? This time, Maya turned to face him. The system doesn't change on its own. It changes because people force it to. People like you, who decide enough is enough. Hayes met her gaze, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of something stronger than fear, resolve. The sound of a twig snapping outside cut through the quiet, and Maya's attention snapped back to the window. Her body tensed as she scanned the darkness, searching for the source of the noise. Hayes rose to his feet, his hand instinctively moving toward the baton at his belt. What is it? He whispered. Maya held up a hand, signaling for silence. The forest had gone still, the usual hum of nighttime activity replaced by an eerie quiet. He's here, she said softly, her voice steady. Hayes' face paled, but he nodded, his grip tightening on the baton. Maya stepped away from the window, her movements deliberate and quiet. She knew this moment would come, the inevitable confrontation. Men like Collins didn't let challenges to their authority go unanswered. As the sound of footsteps drew closer, Maya felt a strange sense of calm settle over her. She had faced worse. She would face this, too. The fight wasn't over. It was only beginning. The night outside the cabin pressed in like a heavy fog, the stillness broken only by the faint crunch of approaching footsteps. Inside, the air was tense. Maya Reed stood near the center of the room, her posture calm but alert. Officer Chris Hayes hovered by the far wall, his face pale, his fingers nervously clutching the baton at his side. Maya glanced at him, her voice low but steady. Stay quiet. He wants us rattled. Hayes nodded but said nothing, his gaze flickering to the single window where faint moonlight seeped through the grime. He was younger than Maya by at least a decade. But at that moment, he looked even younger, like someone realizing for the first time how easily the world's edges could fray. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. The silence that followed was thicker than the air in the room. Maya could almost feel the weight of Colin's presence. The calculated patience of a man who believed control was his birthright. The door swung open slowly, the hinges groaning as if in protest. Nathan Collins stepped inside, his tall frame casting a shadow across the dimly lit space. He held a flashlight in one hand, its beam cutting through the darkness, and a baton in the other. His face was unreadable at first, but his eyes betrayed him sharp, unyielding, and filled with something darker than anger. "So this is where you ran," he said, his voice measured. The words didn't carry the volume of a shout, but they didn't need to. Each syllable was deliberate, designed to remind everyone in the room who held the power. Maya stood her ground, her expression calm but unyielding. "You've gone too far, Collins," she said. "This ends tonight." Collins smirked, stepping further into the room. "Ends? You think you're in a position to make that call?" He gestured vaguely toward Hayes. "You've dragged this rookie into something he doesn't understand. That's on you." Hayes stiffened but said nothing. Maya didn't glance his way. Her focus was entirely on Collins. "He understands more than you think. You're not as untouchable as you believe." Collins chuckled, a low, humorless sound. "You don't get it, do you? This isn't about me. It's about people like you who think they can walk into places they don't belong and act like the rules don't apply." Maya felt a flicker of anger stir in her chest. But she didn't let it show. She had learned long ago that men like Collins fed on visible emotion. The only rules I've broken are the ones you've twisted for yourself. And deep down, you know it. For a moment, Collins' mask slipped, his jaw tightened, and something flashed in his eyes, something almost like fear. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared, replaced by a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You think this is about some moral high ground?" he said, stepping closer. "You're just a pawn in a game you don't even understand." Maya stayed where she was, her voice even. "If that's true, then you've already lost." Colin's smirk faded, and he raised the baton slightly. "You really think you're going to walk out of here?" he asked. "After everything you've done?" "Everything I've done?" Maya repeated, her tone sharp but not raised. "The only thing I've done is refuse to let you keep abusing the power you were given." "That scares you, doesn't it?" Collins lunged forward suddenly, his baton swinging toward her. Maya reacted instinctively, stepping aside and grabbing a nearby chair to block his attack. The sound of wood splintering filled the room as the baton connected. But Maya didn't falter. She moved swiftly, using her training to keep her balance and create distance. Hayes, frozen at first, seemed to snap out of his fear. He moved toward Collins hesitantly, his grip on the baton trembling. "Stop this," he shouted, though his voice cracked under the weight of the moment. Collins turned to him, his expression dark. "Stay out of this, Hayes. You don't have the spine for it." Hayes hesitated, his fear evident, but Maya's voice cut through the tension. "Hayes, don't let him pull you into his game. You're better than this." Hayes looked at her, his eyes wide, and for a moment, Maya wasn't sure what he would do. Then, with a deep breath, he stepped forward, placing himself between her and Collins. "No," he said, his voice firmer this time. "This isn't right. It never was." Collins stared at him, his face a mask of disbelief. "You're throwing your career away for her?" he spat. "For what?" "For doing the right thing," Hayes said, though his hands still shook. Maya saw her opening. She moved quickly, grabbing a heavy metal pipe from the corner of the room. Collins turned just as she swung, the pipe connecting with his baton and knocking it from his hand. He stumbled back, his face contorted with rage. "You think this changes anything?" he snarled, his voice low and dangerous. "You think this is over?" "It's over for you," Maya said quietly. "The people you've stepped on, the ones you thought were too small to matter, they're not silent anymore." The sound of sirens in the distance broke through the standoff. Collins froze, his eyes darting toward the door. For the first time, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his expression. Maya straightened, her voice calm but resolute. "They're coming for you, Collins, you can't run from this. Collins glared at her, his fists clenching at his sides. For a moment, it seemed like he might attack again. But the growing wail of the sirens held him back. With a muttered curse, he turned and bolted out the door, disappearing into the darkness of the woods. Maya didn't chase him. She knew the officers would be there any second, and Collins wouldn't get far. Instead, she turned to Hayes, who was still standing frozen in place. You did the right thing, she said gently. Hayes exhaled shakily, his shoulders slumping. I almost didn't, he admitted. I almost froze. But you didn't, Maya said. And that matters. The flashing lights of the police cars filled the cabin, their bright beams cutting through the darkness. As the officers poured in, Maya felt a sense of quiet relief. The fight wasn't over, not yet, but tonight. At least, justice had taken a step forward. The morning light filtered softly through the blinds of the FBI field office, illuminating the faint dust motes in the air. Maya Reed sat at her desk, a cup of lukewarm coffee untouched at her side. The events of the night still lingered in her mind, not as fresh wounds but as persistent echoes. The room around her hummed with quiet activity, phones ringing, conversations murmured, footsteps purposeful. It was the rhythm of her world, steady and unyielding. Across the desk sat Officer Chris Hayes, his shoulders hunched, his eyes fixed on his hands. He had been debriefed earlier by a senior agent, but his expression held the weight of someone still processing the cost of his choices. Maya had seen that look before, the realization of what it meant to challenge a system that had always seemed immovable. You made the right call, Maya said, breaking the silence. Her tone was gentle, her words steady. She wasn't trying to convince him, only to remind him. Hayes looked up, his gaze uncertain. Did I? Collins is out there somewhere, probably regrouping. He'll try to come back from this. He might, Maya replied, leaning back in her chair. But you took the first step. You stood up. That matters more than you think. Hayes nodded slowly, though the tension in his face didn't ease. It just feels like it's not enough. He's been doing this for years. And I stood by for most of it. So did everyone else. Maya regarded him thoughtfully. Change doesn't happen all at once, Hayes. It's slow, frustratingly slow. But it starts with moments like this, when someone decides they've had enough. The door to the office opened, and Agent Alan Carter stepped in, his presence calm but commanding. He carried a file in one hand, its edges worn from use. Maya, he said, nodding to her before glancing at Hayes. Good to see you here. Hayes shifted uncomfortably, but Maya gestured for him to stay seated. What do we know? She asked. Carter placed the file on her desk, flipping it open. Inside were reports, witness statements, and photographs. Collins is on the run. But we've got enough to issue a warrant. Testimonies from other officers have started coming in. Seems Hayes wasn't the only one fed up. Once word spread that you were pressing charges, others decided to come forward. Maya's lips pressed into a thin line. It was progress, but it didn't erase the reality of what had allowed Collins to thrive for so long. And the precinct? She asked. Carter sighed, his expression darkening. It's going to take more than one bad apple to justify a full investigation. But with what we've gathered, we can at least push for some oversight. Maya nodded. She had expected as much. The system moved slowly, often reluctantly, especially when it came to examining itself. But this was a start, a small crack in the wall that had shielded men like Collins for too long. Hayes shifted in his seat again, his voice hesitant. What happens if they don't find him? What if he disappears? They'll find him, Maya said simply. Men like Collins don't know how to disappear. They've built their lives on being seen, on having power. He'll slip up, and when he does, we'll be there. Carter gave a small nod of agreement. In the meantime, we've got enough evidence to expose him publicly. Even if he's not in custody yet, his reputation won't survive this. The weight of those words seemed to settle over Hayes, though he still looked uncertain. Maya watched him for a moment before speaking again. What Collins did wasn't just about him. It was about a system that let him act with impunity. You stepping up, me standing my ground. That's not just about stopping one man. It's about forcing the system to reckon with itself. Hayes glanced at her, his expression conflicted. And do you think it will reckon with itself? Maya didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached for her coffee, taking a small sip before setting the cup back down. I think it can. But only if we keep pushing. Only if people like you keep speaking out. The room fell quiet again. The kind of silence that wasn't uncomfortable but reflective. Outside, the city buzzed with life, oblivious to the small battles being fought in rooms like this one. After a moment, Hayes stood, his movements slow but deliberate. I should go, he said. There's still a lot to figure out. Maya nodded, rising to her feet. You did good, Hayes. Don't forget that. He offered a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. And then he left, the door clicking softly shut behind him. Carter turned back to Maya, his expression thoughtful. You think he'll be okay? He's stronger than he thinks, Maya replied. But it's not easy. Stepping out of the shadows. Carter studied her for a moment before giving a small nod. And you? How are you holding up? Maya's gaze drifted to the file on her desk. The images and words a stark reminder of the battle ahead. I'm fine, she said. This isn't the first fight. And it won't be the last. Carter gave her a knowing look. No, it won't. He paused, then added, but for what it's worth. I think you're making a difference. Maya didn't respond right away. Instead, she closed the file and straightened her desk. Her movements measured and deliberate. Let's hope so, she said finally. As Carter left the room, Maya leaned back in her chair, her gaze turning to the window. The city stretched out before her, a patchwork of light and shadow, of progress and resistance. It was a reminder that the work she did, no matter how exhausting, no matter how slow, mattered. She exhaled softly, a sense of quiet resolve settling over her. The fight wasn't over, but she hadn't expected it to be. Change never came easily, but it came, piece by piece, step by step, and that was enough. For now.